it.
Oh.
Nugget schedule has been released. We got lots of thoughts on it. Marquee games, marquee nights. Will Embiid duck? When will Embiid duck Jokic again? Plus, I have some concerns. We'll get to that on Locked On Nuggets.
You are Locked On Nuggets, your daily Denver Nuggets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Nuggets, your daily Denver Nuggets podcast, part of the Locked On Network, your team every day. Thanks for joining us and making us your first listen and being an everydayer if you choose to. We appreciate you guys being along for the ride on whatever platform that you choose, whether you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or if you're checking us out on YouTube, where you join the show with folks like John P. and Freddie and Senny, and Jesus was in here being very impatient with our start. Zamora in here. Dragutin joins us. Lots of folks hanging out with us on a Thursday night to break down the schedule. Glad to have you guys with us. We appreciate your support every single day. Make sure, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, go to our page there and hit us with a 5-star review. Helps us out so much. Makes us look good to the higher ups over at the Locked On Network. If you are joining us on YouTube, make sure you hit us on the subscribe button and hit the like button. We want to make sure that folks can see it. Make sure you send the show to a friend so that they know there's a great Nuggets podcast out there that you listen to every day. My name is Matt Moore. I'm the senior NBA writer for the Action Network, joined, not supposed to be on tonight, but he very graciously decided not to go to bed and join me, is Adam Mares. So you get two world's finest this week. I appreciate you joining me, buddy. I was prepared to do this one solo.
I know you were. I hope you're cool with me hopping on, and I know you're a schedule guy. I kind of want a front row seat to your schedule takes.
No, I think it's always it's better because this way I don't have to worry about it, right? Like there's always that concern of like, what if this show is 15 minutes? And so with you, I feel like I know I can go ahead and get this to the full 25, 30 minutes that we need to. So today we're going to talk about the schedule. Schedule got released today. Full schedule's out. We had the tournament schedule earlier, and then we got the full schedule. I will probably do a show that talks about explains the in-season tournament sometime closer to the season, maybe like in November, to get you guys like what the hell is this thing? Because there's a lot of people there like, what is this thing? And even me, who obsesses over these details, I keep forgetting like little things in there. So there's a lot of stuff. I will say, Adam, did you know that we don't have the full schedule?
I do know that. Only 80 games.
Only 80 games because based off of whoever does not make it to the knockout stages of the in-season tournament, they will randomly they will select an opponent based off an algorithm. Two teams will face an out-of-conference opponent, not yet known. So we don't know what the other two games on the schedule are going to be for Denver, which is, I think, very interesting when you look at, I'm very excited about this because I get to go back in April and be like, these two teams are separated by a game due to tiebreaker. Guess what that difference is? The randomly assorted games that we got that week of the play-in tournament. So I'm excited for that nerd history to go on later. So the going joke is always like, hey, I got some details on the NBA schedule for this team. They're going to play 41 at home and 41 away. There's this idea that all schedules are kind of made equal. I do want to make sure that I don't go too far the other way. So I want to kind of ask you, how important do you think the schedule is in terms of determining an NBA season?
Not very. I mean, I do think there are good and bad schedules, and there are things that can break. Your schedule can hurt you, but it has more to do with if certain things happen throughout the course of your season, right? Like you suffer an injury early and then all of a sudden this lopsided schedule comes back to haunt you or what have you. But I think on its face, the gap between the best, most favorable schedule and worst, least favorable schedule is like a game and a half max. So I think It makes a small difference. But what really makes a difference is if you have an unbalanced schedule, you're more susceptible to a freak incident hurting you more than it should.
I think that's well put. I think the reason that you can't sit here and say their schedule is awesome at the outset or their schedule is terrible is because, as you mentioned, it depends on where you're at. if you happen to be run down and you have a light schedule in terms of travel, that will, alleviate it somewhat. Versus, I think there's compounding effects here where it's like, look, if they lose AG and MPJ gets banged up in the same month, like they're screwed anyway. But if that also happens in a month where they've got a lot of road games stacked on each other and several back-to-backs, that makes it all the worse because you can't. That means more minutes for guys that have to play more games. Like there's this compounding effect that you kind of got to go into. I do like looking at it from the context of one. Like I look at the first thing I look at when I open up, there's a great app that somebody put together, Positive Residual on Twitter. He put together this app that basically you can do it by date, and you can look at like all the back-to-backs and the rest advantages and disadvantages and all those types of things. And the first thing that I actually look at is miles, because a lot of the research that's been done on NBA bodies and the fatigue is not actually about frequency of games. This is why the home back-to-backs are okay. Flying is inherently bad for the body. It's worse for athletes. It's worse for athletes in between two performances. And so road back-to-backs are especially caustic towards the body. So I'm always looking at like, how many miles do you travel? And Denver's always pretty high on that list because I don't know if you know this, but there's not much around here. We have giant mountains on one side and Kansas on the other. It's hard to get places. I think Portland every year has the worst schedule because they're somehow in the Northwest Division, despite being on the West Coast. So just in their division alone, they have to travel so far. Right.
Denver's up there though.
And it's interesting that you had mentioned that because you're like, at most, this matters like a game and a half. And what's interesting for me is like that game and a half is like so important because it could be the difference between the 3rd seed and the 5th seed. And that differential is often so much. Now it may not, like the Nuggets may win 63 games and clear everything by 10. But it is just kind of interesting to look at like these margins and how close things can be in the NBA based off of those types of things. We talked about the Lakers on opening night. Before I kind of get into like the nitty gritty of the schedule analysis here in the upfront section, I did want to kind of ask you, second game, they're at Memphis on Friday. So they do get Wednesday, Thursday off, which is nice of the league. They play Memphis on Friday. Are you excited for that game? Like, where does Memphis rank in terms of like games that you like? Do you get excited for Memphis games at all?
Not really. I mean, Memphis is not a team I enjoy watching. Without Ja, they might be slightly more interesting. I don't know. I mean, to me, they're just another team.
Yeah. And then what are like the games that you most wanted to see, like that were on the schedule that you most wanted to see when they were? Were there any that you were like, I want to know when they're facing X team?
I mean, part of this is like they're going to face them at some point.
Right.
And if it's not at a specific date that you're looking at, like week 1 or, whatever, then it's kind of weird to be like, ooh, 3rd week of January, like it doesn't make sense. So not really. I mean, I looked at the big dates. I looked at the end of the schedule. I always look to see did Denver pull a bunch of tanking teams because that could help you out. They get San Antonio twice in April who might be tanking by that point. But not really. I mean, I'm excited for specific games, but where they fall in the calendar seems almost incidental.
Yeah, I think I'm more of what I was looking for is just like, what are the games that you're like, ooh, I want to make sure that I might have that down. So like, I'm looking forward to that.
Philadelphia. I always look forward to those Philadelphia games. Both of them being on national television, both of them being within 11 days of each other. The first one, January 16th at Philadelphia on TNT.
Rivalry week.
Is that what it is? Is that rivalry week?
Yes.
At Philadelphia?
Yes.
Okay. And then they play in Denver 11 days later in a matinee. So those ones are kind of interesting to me.
I'm sorry, I got that confused. The one in Denver is rivalry week. It's the last.
Oh, really?
Yep. They because they gave Philly that matchup last year for rivalry week, so they put it in Denver this year.
Embiid's playing this one, Matt, and I'm so happy that the narrative caught up to like Richard Jefferson was joking about it today. About, Embiid won't play that one. He never plays in Denver. So I like that it's finally like gotten to the point where it's a talking point outside of just the Denver-Philly rivalry.
Well, I have a question for you. How sure are you that Embiid's going to be playing in that game if he's not on the Sixers?
Well, that was actually I will say this. I made mention of this earlier, but the NBA scheduled that before the trade deadline. Very smart. Both matchups before the trade deadline.
Nice.
They
Good
might,
note.
Jokic and Embiid might play each other more times this year than they have in their entire careers. There's
True.
a chance.
It's true. They could actually match up more than once. On the other side, we'll talk about my thoughts on the schedule, the kind of flow of the season, some of the concerns that I have of what's a pretty good schedule overall for Denver, why I'm concerned about the specific makeup of it, and all that and more on the other side on Locked On Nuggets. First, I need to tell you about FanDuel Sportsbook. Football season's about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long. Because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. I've talked about this before. I used this bonus bet on the Bengals. That was the best bet that I could find. Burrow is still slinging 50-yard passes in practice already with the calf issue. I think he'll be good to go week 1. I'm probably going to bet against him, but I think he's going to be good to go week 1. And I think that he's going to have a monster season. I don't mind Joe Burrow MVP bets. I think the Bengals are going to win a ton of games. I think they stand to benefit if this division disappoints, which there's some thought that it's really great. Maybe it is. But if it disappoints, I think the Bengals are the one that separates itself. I think there's a very good chance that they get a bye. If they get a bye, then we're 2 games away from them being in the Super Bowl. And that's, you've got a great hedge opportunity there. Pick any team to win the Super Bowl and you'll get bonus bets for every win in the regular season. You can use your bonus bets on spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. We'll be right back on Locked On Nuggets. Back here on Locked On Nuggets, thanks for joining us and making us part of your day. Appreciate you guys being with us on a Thursday night, or if you're listening to us in the morning and on a Friday, appreciate you guys being with us. Talk about the NBA schedule, which was released, and the Denver Nuggets have 80 games on the schedule, if you're wondering.
But before you break it down, though, Matt, because I know you're going to break down what you're concerned, can I just start by saying I think it's a great schedule. In fact, my ultimate takeaway is that Denver's schedule is extremely balanced. They almost play the same number of road games as home games every single month. They have the fewest numbers of 3 games in 4 nights of anybody in the NBA. And there's no section that is especially bad. There is good, better and worse sections. They do have one stretch, I think, from November 19th all the way through December 12th, where they're on the road 10 out of 12. That's easily, I think, the toughest part. But broadly speaking, it's way more balanced than it was last year, where all their home games seem to come in a 6-week stretch.
They are tied for the least back-to-backs, which is 13. Interestingly, the NBA flattened the number of back-to-backs that you can have. So last year there was a wider range of them, and now there's a smaller range.
Smart.
So yeah, so now it's like, and my wife was laughing. She's like, oh, so instead of like fixing it, they just made it so everybody is screwed equally. And I was like, yeah, kind of.
But that's fixing it in a way.
Yeah, it's better than having the outliers, because you chop the ends off of both sides, where it's not one team is at a huge problem. Rest disadvantage, Denver's tied for the second fewest with 9. Only one team has fewer, and that's Chicago. There's a bunch of teams with 9, so pretty good slot there. Straight to schedule, they technically have the easiest, in part because positive residual does account for altitude and travel, and so that benefits them. But because of the amount of miles that Denver travels, it's actually pretty good as far as like that perspective looks at it. So yeah, I don't think that this is like a brutal schedule. I think this is a pretty good schedule. There's only been one team I found so far who has like a nightmare schedule.
Who is it?
The Clippers.
Oh, right. I've been seeing a lot of things there. Yeah.
In part, that's because of the arena, because they have so many things already scheduled at crypto, and then Lakers get first pick. That's why there's like a lot of like Clippers fans you'll notice are like, we got to get the new building built. Like they just got to get to a new arena, but they are incredibly screwed. Most 3 and 4s, most back-to-backs. Like you go on down the line, the Clippers got the rough one of all of it. Okay. The reason I have concerns is specifically built off of what we're expecting from the Nuggets this season. You have a team coming off a championship. You have a team that Jokic was talking after the season, and maybe he feels great, right? Like maybe this time winning all these horse races in Serbia has rested his spirit, his mind, and his body, and he's good to go. But he kind of talked about how he would need to take some more time. Obviously, it was enough for him to miss FIBA World Cup, which is significant. Jamal has had to miss FIBA World Cup as well with Team Canada. Like this team's going to be there's going to be a little bit of a hangover effect, not only from the championship and celebration, an emotional letdown after, but there's also just like they played later than any other team besides Miami. So they went the latest. There's kind of a wear down effect there. So my biggest concern is that early part of the season before they kind of settle in, and they're incorporating probably a lot of newer components into the rotation. Like top 5 is set. Christian obviously knows his role. That should be fine. Reggie didn't play much, right? And then it's a bunch of it's Zeke and a bunch of young guys, especially with Vlatko out. So there will be a little bit of figuring some stuff out early. And the big key here is the schedule is front loaded backlight from All-Star to the season's end. So the back end of their schedule, they have 15 of 27 at home. They have 3 rest advantage games to just 2 rest disadvantage games. They're middle of the pack in miles traveled, when that's, again, pretty high anyway because of where they're located. And they're tied for the fewest back-to-backs in that stretch with just 3. So the back half of that schedule after All-Star break, if they've got to make up ground, they're in a really good spot. If they do the work early and they push through, they can coast a little bit more because the path is a little bit easier on the backside. Just in terms of rest and travel, it's pretty easy. I also noticed this, Adam, that when we look at the actual calendar for them, I thought this was actually kind of interesting that their last time facing an Eastern Conference team on the road, they played Miami on March 13th, which is pretty close to the end of the season. They play Milwaukee on February 12th. Those are the only 2 Eastern Conference road trip games they have after January 25th.
Wow.
So by January 25th, they're done with all but 2 of their East Coast road trip games.
And East Coast, one of those being Milwaukee, which is like not even the East.
Right.
Geographically speaking, it's crazy. At Miami is obviously quite the hike, but man, that's a great catch, Matt. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and that was a big part of it last year was they would have these one-offs where it was like they would play 2 at home, fly to an East Coast city, fly all the way back, have 1 game, go back out on the road and play a back-to-back. And that was the kind of stuff where the team would complain a lot and the front office would complain a lot about the schedule stuff. So it looks very much like the powers that be have kind of settled a little bit of that. They do have, you mentioned that Philadelphia on January 16th. That's part of a 5-game road trip to the East Coast. That is the last road trip that they've got more than 4 games. And that's Philly, Boston, Washington, Indiana, New York. Except for Washington, I expect all those teams to be playoff teams. So that mid-January stretch is going to be really tough. The counter to this in terms of it being backlight, there is a lot of stuff in the first half of the season, especially in the first quarter of the season. They traveled the most miles in their first 21 games of any team in the league at over 16,000. If you want to compare that, Indiana's got the fewest at 7,000. The miles in terms of the time spent on planes is my concern here. Is that the amount of time that you like a short flight is not that big of a deal, but it's these long flights that wind up causing some issues with player recovery and things along the way. And that's why you've got, in November, you've got at New Orleans, up to Cleveland, up to Detroit, back down to Orlando, over to Houston, home from Houston for a San Antonio game, then back over to LA. Like that's the kind of stuff that's pretty tough in the early going. And then on top of it,
Denver might punt that Clippers game, by the way. If you look at it, that's the second night of a back-to-back coming off a 5-game road trip. You come home, and then you have a back-to-back going back out to the Clippers. I would not be surprised if that's one of those games where, like, Murray and Jokic just don't travel. It gives themselves a little break in between what is essentially a 5-game road trip and a 4-game road trip.
Yeah. And then the other thing that's in the first part of the schedule, by December 15th, Denver plays 6 back-to-backs. That is a lot for a team that was looking, I think, to probably like ease into the season and just kind of this is not, the schedule is not built for that. They're either going to get beat up and have to make up ground, or they're going to have to really grind, and then they're going to be beat up in the back half. I don't know what the better approach is, but just from a travel perspective, because one of the things I don't necessarily look a lot at the SOS stuff because it's all based off of last year. And like your numbers are going to look very easy. Last year, here's a good example of it. Milwaukee's strength of schedule was pretty easy last year because they've played Detroit and Indiana. Well, I think Detroit and Indiana are going to be a lot better this season. And I think
that's part of this. There's a lot of good teams. There's not a lot of games where you're like, oh, that's an easy one, honestly. Mm-hmm. I mean, what are the easy teams? To me, you said Detroit. I think Detroit's easy. I mean, they're not a pushover,
yes,
but they're not.
They're definitely easy, yes.
And then I think like San Antonio, Houston, there's Washington, but there's probably only 5 or 6. The rest of them are, I don't know if Indiana, how great they are, but that's a tough game. Like at Indiana, that's a tough one.
That's a tough game. I agree. 4 of their final 6 are on the road. They're at the Clippers. They're home for Atlanta. They're at the Jazz. They're home for Minnesota, but that's also on a back-to-back. They got Minnesota on another back-to-back. At the Spurs, that's an easy one at the end of the season, a tank job. And then they're at Memphis. I love these kind of things. I like looking at this stuff because I look at that Memphis game and I'm like, there's one of 2 ways that goes. That game means nothing to either team, or it's like this could determine who's got the 2nd and 3rd seed. Like this could be for home court in the second round of the playoffs. So, and that's kind of how the league schedules it, is like, yeah, maybe it won't matter, but if it does, it matters a lot. And so I think that's part of the schedule there. So when I talk about how the schedule is structured, I agree with you that it's pretty well balanced. I think the league did a very good job this year. I do wonder if they got some help from machine learning finally, which has been a constant criticism from people.
Our theory, Matt, at DNVR is just that the league clearly prioritizes certain teams over others. I think a lot of that has to do with national televised games.
Yeah.
And this year Denver has a lot. So guess what? They were probably a priority. I honestly think that's part of it, is if you start with your national television schedule, that means you're starting with the teams who are good or who you value a lot. And then you get to the leftovers. And Denver traditionally is one of the leftovers. But this year
you also can't be this has been my thing for years, that if you're the NBA, you can't be like, we need you guys to play these games. These marquee games are important. This is a showcase of our best talent. Oh, by the way, you're on a back-to-back flying halfway across the country. Like you can't. No, like if those games matter, schedule them as such. And it looks a lot more like the league has done that. So I have concerns about like what this means for Denver. I'll put it this way. I've been bearish on Denver's like upside reaching their ceiling pretty much since the end of the season and through free agency, since Bruce left effectively. I don't feel better after the schedule came out because of the way that it's structured. Like they do have a low number of back-to-backs, but I am worried that they're going to have a front heavy schedule when maybe they're not in the best position to come out roaring out of the gates. Does that make sense?
It does. I just kind of almost take the opposite approach. I do think Denver will struggle early on, but I just think it's good for them. I think that's there's a good chance that by December 12th, which is the end of what I would consider the tough part, I think it ends. December 12th at Chicago, that ends sort of like a lot of road heavy portion of it. By there, I wouldn't be surprised if Denver's 4, 5, 6 seed, something like that. Mm-hmm. And it feels like a panic. But then the last 2/3, not even the halfway points, the last 2/3 of their season then become extremely favorable, and they'll just probably slowly chip away and make up ground.
I already know, like, this is what I want to ask Malone at media days. Like, are you going to be able to deal with losses early in the season if it means getting guys rested and not getting caught in the trap of trying to chase the record early? Like, that to me is
no matter what he says, Matt, he will not be honest. Not that he'll be lying. It's just that there's no way he can answer that because that requires him feeling the emotions he will only feel once the season begins.
It's true. It's true. It's true. I'm still going to ask it. I'm still absolutely going to ask it. On the other side, we got some requests from the folks to talk about some stuff, and I actually would like to get some Adam's thoughts about some other stuff that's not on the schedule. So we'll get to that on the other side when we return on Locked On Nuggets. Back here on Locked On Nuggets. Thanks for joining us and making us part of your day. Appreciate you guys being with us on a Friday. Hope you guys' week was great. I've been a little under the weather, but other than that, mine's been good. My kids are out of the house, Adam. They're out of the house. They're back at school.
Back at school? Yeah.
Like Tuesday, my wife and I just sat in our living room and quiet. And that was all we did. Just being quiet. So amazing. My wife goes back to school next week. Love my wife. Beautiful woman. Incredible woman. Cannot wait to have the house back to myself. Working from home when your kids and family are gone it's good. All right. So we had some questions about some of this stuff. First off, I do want to kind of touch on the WNBA stuff. There's been a group, the commissioner of the WNBA and a group from the WNBA met with a pack of investors in Denver this week. And they are apparently one of the finalists for an expansion team in 2025. So I am curious if you have, and you don't have to have like a lot of takes here, just like if you have a general take on the concept of a WNBA team in Denver.
I would be surprised how popular it would be, but I will say Denver is a hotbed for women's hoops. So to me, it does seem like a natural fit. Colorado has produced a lot of great women's collegiate basketball players, like disproportionately so. It's a terrible men's basketball state. There's not a lot of great basketball players that come out of Colorado on the men's side, but on the women's side, there's a lot. So you would think there would be a market for it. I am curious though. The Nuggets, when they're not good, get no traction. So I'm a little bit skeptical that like a rebuilding, because usually when you're an expansion team, you have to ramp up. I'm a little skeptical that Denver would show up for it, but I don't know. Denver is the most saturated sports city given its size. There's 4 major sports teams. There's a soccer team. There's lacrosse teams. There's just so many different things. But other than that part of it, all for it.
I'm apprehensive because I love the idea of going and covering WNBA games, but like I need the time in the summer to not.
Oh, you for personal reasons. This is you for personal reasons.
Yeah. This is just like, oh man, my kids are gonna kill me if I'm like, I'm sorry, I gotta go. The Aces are in town. I think I would personally really enjoy it. I like you question the popularity in Denver, but that's mostly.
I mean, we saw Jokic-led teams that got nobody at the arena.
Yeah.
In like 2017, 18, so.
Yeah, I think there's a genuine question. I think it's okay for us to be, and like, you just don't want it to fail, right? Like that's my thing is like, even if it's not popular, I don't really care. Cause like I've made this argument about the NBA when there's all the talk about the ratings. I'm like, good. I want fewer, like more people means more interest, which means like I have to fight for a larger share. No, I'm good. Like I like my niche sport. It's fine. But what you don't want is for it to fail. I think that's kind of the way that works out. The other question, Hurricane asked this, and he wanted us to touch on the James Harden nonsense. My thing has been, it's been kind of funny to see this because I didn't intend for this because Harden's not on my top 10 favorite players ever. He's not on my like top 20 favorite players ever. I've spent more time actually covering Harden and breaking down his game than any other player in the league, including Jokic. It just so happened that like, I know, when he was competing for MVP between 2015 and 2019, those were my years at CBS. And so those were the years when I was doing most of the work on MVP more than anything else. So like I poured a lot into covering Harden and breaking down his game as an effort to like understand how good he was and how to compare him to Russ or Kawhi or Giannis or whoever. So like I've done that. And when I moved to action, and also like honestly in the years that Jokic won it, like Jokic was like so dominant. And also I will cop to this too. You know how we've talked about like taking him for granted. I struggle with like how to describe Joker because I see him every night. Like he leaves me at a loss for words, which is very rare. I don't know if you know this, but I talk a lot. So like I have a hard time with it. But the thing is like, I understand how great Harden was in his prime. And I also know that that's not who he is anymore. Like I've largely just been like, look, the reason I'm not making a big stink over what's going on with Harden in Philly is I don't know that James Harden matters anymore.
See, here's what's funny about James Harden. I disagree with you on that part. I think he's great. He's not what he was. Like James Harden of 2014, 15, 16, like that guy was unbelievable, almost unstoppable. I think he's still, underrated in how good of a player he was in this last season. Mm-hmm. The thing is that even at his height, you question whether or not he could get it done for reasons that didn't necessarily have to do with his game. Yeah. Leadership, his toughness under pressure and all those different things. Time has not made him more robust, more tough, more resolved in
Yeah.
any of these things. They've actually gone the opposite direction. So to me, that's the thing about Harden. I actually still think he's a useful player. Somebody, who was it, Kendrick Perkins, that said if he's not careful, he's going to be out the league, and that created this big debate. I actually think it's a fair statement, not because he's not talented enough. I think he's super talented. I think he is probably can be the second best player on a title team if it's the right one. I still think he is right around that level. I have no faith in him doing it. And superstar players, when they get to this age, you start to burn enough bridges that who's going to take that chance on you? Because you don't have a big window. You kind of have to go all. If you believe in James Harden, you have to go all in on getting James Harden. And what GM wants to do that?
No.
Nobody's going to stick their neck out for James Harden right now.
You know what's funny about that? Because I agree with you, he's kind of underrated basketball-wise. He led the league in assists last year. Again. He did it again.
He's just not a winner, man. He's not a winner.
And I'll say it, he got Joel Embiid MVP.
That's the best take.
If you dig into it, why did Joel Embiid win MVP? Because he led the league in scoring. Where did most of his scoring come from?
Oh, I'm stealing. Can I steal this?
Mid-range jumper. Take it. Take it. All yours, buddy. Oh, you should have heard the stuff I said on Ryan Blackburn's podcast last night. I had Ryan Blackburn being tempted to defend Embiid. That's what I said. Go check out Pickaxe and Roll.
Oh, I can't wait. I love it. I love it.
Takes. But regardless, so I don't necessarily care about the Harden trade. The reason is not about the basketball stuff. It's the stuff that you mentioned. It's not just that he doesn't show up in the playoffs, because honestly, he won them game 2 and game 4 of that Celtics series and didn't have anything else for him the rest of the series. That's who he is now. For me, it's I love it. He is so passive aggressive and has always been so. That's why whenever anybody's tries to say that comment in China this last weekend it was off the cuff or it wasn't scripted, I was like, James Harden is not wired that way. That's not what he does. He was passive aggressive with Dwight Howard. He was passive aggressive with Chris Paul. He has always been extremely that's been a constant refrain from people. If you talk to people that know him, that have been around him, that's been the complaint is look, the good part of it is Harden doesn't make life necessarily hard on you every day. He's not an obnoxious personality like DeMarcus Cousins, right? The problem is that he's also not confrontational when there is an issue. He sulks, he pouts, he complains behind the scenes at everybody. He rolls his eyes. It's the passive aggressive stuff. And that to me ties into what you're talking about in not being a winner. That stuff I do think translates here is if you're going to be a leader of people, which you have to be as the best player, I think you cannot do it behind a veil of passive aggressiveness. You need to be direct with your approach in solving these problems and mitigating it, understanding strengths and weaknesses and how to get the most out of everybody. Harden is not wired that way.
Yeah. It goes deeper even than that. I mean, there's all talk about Jokic, no ego, this or that. James Harden is on the opposite end of that spectrum. He's supreme ego. All the stuff he says is I statements. He's a big I guy. Mm-hmm. And it's just those things. Oh, you can handle a little bit of it. Let's not kid ourselves. Everybody has an ego to some extent, and not everyone has to be Jokic to win. Players with an ego have won, but his just seems to be so far off over the threshold that it's I don't think he'll ever get it done. And as evidenced in part by this, Daryl Morey has given him half the money he's made. Daryl Morey's the guy that pulled him from Oklahoma City and said, guess what? We're going to revolutionize the game in this way around your whole skill set. If ever there was a guy to maybe just look and be all right, don't see eye to eye. Maybe he made a promise under the table that he didn't fulfill, but he also revolutionized the game with me, seeing something in me that nobody else did. People don't remember this. That Harden trade at the time was a little wild. And I remember game 1 of the season when he went to Houston. Game 1, he had 50 points. And it was what? James Harden had 50?
Yeah.
Daryl Morey knew. He was I know he's going to have a lot of 50-point games. So to me, it just shows you a little bit of who he is to see that guy. I'm not saying he has to love the guy, but the way he's handling this is man, there's no love for the old days. There's no love for anything that anybody did to get you here.
Somebody that knows Daryl has worked with him before told me this. They said Daryl's a lot of things that you can criticize. You can call him cold-blooded. You can call him dispassionate. You can call him too analytical. You can't call him a liar. He's pretty upfront. I talked to a player once that relayed to me that he was talking to Daryl about he was really worried he was going to get traded. And so he goes to Daryl and he's like, I'm really worried I'm going to get traded, man. Like, can we agree? Like, can we agree on an extension? Like, I'm really worried. Like, I want to be here. I love it here. This is where I want to be. And Daryl just said, I know, man, it's tough. And he traded him like 2 months later. And that's how Daryl does things.
I as much as I can agree with you, Daryl is a different type of GM. The only thing I'll say is it seemed at the time when Harden took the discount, it was like, this sure seems like he'll just re-up a little bit later. And Daryl is in a precarious situation as well because the process is coming to an end. And this might be a situation where Daryl made a promise he really meant to fulfill and is now in a spot where he's like, if I do this, I'm going to lose my job. Mm-hmm. And I honestly think it's there. And let me ask you this, because this is the most interesting question. What do you think is the end of this? Is it Harden gets traded before camp begins and they get some players back and they just go forward? Is it this goes into the season? Is it Daryl Morey gets fired eventually? Is it Joel Embiid demands a trade before the end of the season? How deep do you think this disaster goes?
I kind of think it's going to be Harden gets traded and 48 hours later Embiid gets traded and Daryl Morey. Who
better to rebuild than Daryl Morey?
and then Daryl Morey's gone at the end of the season.
Okay, I see.
That's that would be my prediction based on, and that's not. Let me be very clear on this. This is not. I've heard this is what's going to happen. This is. I have all these different pieces of information that I've heard from different people, and I have pulled them together, and like this is my conclusion, and that's genuinely what I think is going to end. If you ask me like what the odds-on favorite for like the outcome should be, it should still be Harden gets traded, Embiid stays, Morey stays. I just think that circumstances are such that that's unlikely to happen. So,
Embiid getting traded this year would probably be the biggest story of the year, don't you think? That would be the biggest story of the year.
Well, we'll see what happens with Milwaukee. That'll do it for Locked On Nuggets. Thanks for joining us on the show. Appreciate you guys being with us on a Friday. Have yourselves a great weekend. We'll be back on Sunday night with World's Finest, where we'll talk about something. We'll come up with other stuff to talk about as the offseason rolls on. We appreciate you guys making us part of your day, though, and listening to us. Make sure to leave us 5-star reviews. Make sure to give us a like and subscribe on YouTube. You can follow Adam on Twitter at Adam_Mares. We'll see you guys again next time.